recognize the way a vigilant mind can stitch a constellation out of static? How 3 coincidences in a week begin to look like choreography? How a fragment of tone in a message becomes a map of intent? How your chest tightens, not at what is known, but at what could be inferred. Pattern hunger feels like intelligence operating at a higher frame rate. It is the pleasure of sense-making flexed to its limit, the pride of seeing what others miss, the safety of detecting trouble before it blooms. Yet the same gift, ungoverned, becomes paranoia overdrive. A vigilant mind sees constellations in static and calls it insight. The cost is chronic suspicion that rots trust from the roots. You stop testing hypotheses and start prosecuting people. Every coincidence becomes a coded threat. The room fills with therefores that sound precise and live on very little air. The psychology underneath is not sinister at first. It is efficient. The brain is a prediction engine. It prefers a world where next is knowable. In predictive processing terms, perception is not a photograph, but a forecast corrected by error signals. The system is rewarded when prediction error is low. Threat raises the stakes. When uncertainty increases, the salience network pours fuel on whatever might reduce the error quickest. This is why an ambiguous tone grabs more of you than a clear sentence. Ambiguity is a tax on the organism. The nervous system pays that tax with vigilance. Vigilance, in turn, makes weak patterns feel strong. Francis Bacon watched this habit centuries ago and named it among the idols of the tribe. The human understanding, he wrote, is of its own nature prone to suppose the existence of more order and regularity in the world than it finds. Notice the generosity and the warning, prone to suppose. The tendency is not moral failure, it is species equipment. But equipment used without calibration produces superstition with the voice of reason. William James added a second blade that cuts just as deep. My experience is what I agree to attend to. Pattern hunger narrows attention around the suspicious, and experience obligingly follows. What you attend to multiplies. What multiplies convinces. Why does suspicion feel like clarity? Because it reduces uncertainty faster than patience ever can. Suspicion offers a story with edges. The body calms at edges, even sharp ones. Seneca mapped the cost of this counterfeit peace. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality. Imagination supplies the missing pieces with a speed reality cannot match. The organism relaxes because the unknown is now known, even if known falsely. The bill arrives later, when trust has been eroded by 100 prosecutions of crimes never committed. There is also arithmetic hiding in the heart. In threat environments, literal or remembered, the cost of a false negative, missing a real danger, feels higher than the cost of a false positive, treating noise as signal. A mind raised to prefer false positives will proudly overdetect. The habit is adaptive on a dark road. It is expensive in a well-lit room. Chronic overdetection corrodes relationships by turning hypotheses into verdicts and questions into cross-examinations. Marcus Aurelius warned himself against that slide with a sentence that rewards slow reread. If someone is able to show me that what I think or do is not right, I will happily change, for I seek the truth by which no one was ever injured. Pattern hunger seeks certainty. Pattern wisdom seeks correction. Consider the machinery that pushes certainty past its evidence. Confirmation bias selects matching data and starves disconfirming details. The availability heuristic makes vivid stories feel common and dry numbers feel unlikely. Proportionality bias assumes big effects must have big causes. Minor coincidences are judged inadequate to explain major feelings, so a larger, darker cause is imported. The fundamental attribution error turns context errors into character verdicts.
A late reply becomes disrespect, not traffic. Each bias is reasonable in a pinch. Together, they assemble a courtroom in which suspicion sets the agenda. Evidence arrives pre-labeled, and acquittal requires an impossible standard.
Past injury turns the gain up. Trauma is the memory of what exceeded your resources. Memory built under overload tends to tag patterns that preceded the blow. Later, the tag feels like prophecy. A scent, a timing, a phrase. Each becomes a siren. The amygdala does not negotiate, it broadcasts. The prefrontal cortex, which might evaluate, is often offline precisely when needed most, under sleep loss, hunger, or social threat. That is why 2 a.m. feels like an honest hour while often being the least reliable. Night amplifies salience and reduces perspective. The mind at 2 a.m. is a courtroom without a defense attorney, a bench where only the prosecution shows up on time. Pattern hunger is helped by a dose of narcissism too subtle to recognize. The flattering belief that one sees through what deceives ordinary men. Nietzsche liked to set traps for this vanity. Convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies. A conviction gives the pleasure of solidity. Truth often gives the discomfort of revision. When pattern hunger hardens into conviction, the organism stops testing. You can hear the shift in grammar. What if becomes of course. Could it be becomes obviously. The hypotheticals turn into declarations before the experiment has begun. The social cost accumulates quietly. Chronic suspicion replaces curiosity with surveillance. Questions arrive loaded. Gestures are decoded rather than received. Friends and partners begin to feel like puzzles to be solved rather than persons to be known. Trust does not fail with a bang. It rots from the roots, fiber by fiber, each time a coincidence is prosecuted as design. Bertrand Russell's cold remark, "The whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain, and wiser people so full of doubts," is not a call to perpetual hesitation. It is a reminder that certainty shows up much earlier than truth does. Doubt, honestly carried, keeps the experiment open long enough to learn. There is a neurological loop worth seeing. Pattern hunger increases dopamine's promise signal, the climb toward anticipated understanding. Each aha delivers a small reward. If the reward is followed by social friction, because the aha was wrong and accused someone unfairly, cortisol rises. Cortisol heightens vigilance. Heightened vigilance produces more ahas. The loop becomes self-propelling. Reward, friction, vigilance, more reward. It is a casino that pays enough to keep you at the table and charges enough to make you sell your watch. Hume, who preferred proportion to passion in matters of belief, set a standard that survives the centuries. A wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. The sentence is not a scold. It is a design principle for the mind. Proportion requires thresholds known in advance, not invented after the fact to defend a verdict already reached. Without thresholds, suspicion runs on anecdotes. With thresholds, anecdotes can start a test, but cannot finish it. Karl Popper pushed the same discipline into a sharper aphorism. Our knowledge can only be finite, while our ignorance must necessarily be infinite. Therefore, the game of inquiry is not to accumulate confirmations, but to risk falsification. Pattern hunger hoards confirmations. Pattern wisdom attempts to kill its favorite idea and watches what survives. Paranoia overdrive is not a moral category. It is a physiological state. Chronic stress shifts the autonomic balance toward sympathetic dominance. Pupils enlarge. Startle response quickens. Sleep fragments. The locus coeruleus drips norepinephrine into attention like too much coffee in a bloodstream. Under this chemistry, the mind prefers stories with sharp edges
because edges promise control. If I can map the threat, I can manage it. Mapping becomes management's substitute. Management never arrives. The system burns fuel without covering miles. Kierkegaard called anxiety the dizziness of freedom. It is a beautiful sentence until the dizziness makes you grab a rail, any rail, including the rail of a narrative that pins another person to intent he never declared. Freedom requires tolerating some wobble between stimulus and conclusion. Pattern hunger hates the wobble and keeps the stomach calm by tightening meanings too soon. The dizziness lifts. The bill, again, arrives later. There is a quieter ethics embedded here. Accusation without adequate ground injures both men. The accused, who bears a judgment he did not earn, and the accuser, whose mind learns to prefer the power of verdicts to the humility of inquiry. Repeated often, the accuser's character reshapes around suspicion. Marcus Aurelius refused to let suspicion set his posture, even when Rome gave him every permission. If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it. To the extent that an inner court must exist, the emperor's rule is hard and clean. Right action and true speech require proportion, not merely passion. What does over-patterning do to love? It replaces intimacy's slow accumulation of warranted expectations with a set of tests. Loyalty tests, purity tests, attention tests. Each test is framed as safety. Each test moves the relationship from a home to a tribunal. Over time, the partner adapts. He speaks with more caveats, then fewer words, then leaves or hides. The outcome then feeds the original belief. C. Men are evasive. The prophecy fulfills itself, not because it was true, but because it was lived upon as if true. Nietzsche's warning about convictions returns. The conviction shapes the world to fit itself and calls that fit proof. There is a phenomenon in statistics called overfitting. A model is trained on noise until it learns the noise as if it were signal. Performance on the training data looks glorious. Performance in the real world collapses. Pattern hunger overfits one person's quirks, one context's coincidences, one season's weather. It then applies the model to new people and new seasons and pronounces them dangerous when they are only different. The fix in statistics is not to stop modeling. It is to regularize, to penalize complexity, to keep a model humble enough to generalize. Minds can regularize too. They just dislike the feeling because humility feels like loss of control until it starts to pay. Notice how midnight changes the shape of a thought. In the small hours, the prefrontal supervisor tires. Amygdala and imagination make private deals. The house is quiet. The prosecution can bring exhibits without a witness for the defense. Even Pascal, who understood solitude as a teacher, admitted our incapacity to sit alone calmly. Night magnifies agency in others and shrinks it in oneself. Morning reverses the lens. Thoughts drafted at 2 a.m. often fail daylight review. This is not an argument against thinking. It is a reminder that time of day is a variable as real as any other in the truth of a conclusion. Trust is a bank account. Deposits are made with clarity kept across time. Withdrawals are made by uncertainty, imposed without explanation. Pattern hunger treats tiny withdrawals as proof the bank is a front for thieves. Over time, the account closes not because the bank was corrupt, but because the auditor lost his instruments. C.S. Lewis described a quieter rot that accompanies such loss. Men begin to do the small wrong thing because the large right thing feels unavailable. In suspicion's economy, small wrongs, spying, engineering a test, extracting a confession by arranging circumstances, feel justified because they promise proof. Proof obtained improperly does not stay proof. it becomes poison. There is also the humiliation factor. To walk back a suspicion is to admit to oneself that one's pattern sense failed. The mind hates this more than it hates being alone. So it looks for secondary evidence to prop the original suspicion long after the available evidence points the other way. Pride gets deputized. Nietzsche plays sheriff again. What is the seal of liberation? No longer being ashamed in front of oneself. Liberation is expensive because it requires switching from self-protection to self-correction. How does a mind move from prosecution back to hypothesis without being told what to do? Often through private experiments small enough to be safe and honest enough to teach. One man writes, in advance, what would count as evidence for and against his suspicion before checking. Another man uses a page of biases as a mirror, reading the list not as a confession, but as calibration. Confirmation bias, availability, proportionality, fundamental attribution, halo effect. A third man adds a single skeptic to his circle, the one friend who doubts lovingly by default, and notices how often that presence lowers his temperature. A fourth man discovers that verdicts drafted after midnight tend to be incorrect by noon, and quietly stops letting night thoughts sign contracts. None of these moves are commandments. They are ways that minds have learned to lengthen the distance between a pattern felt and a person blamed. Language can be tuned. He is doing X to me carries a charge the body hears as assault. I notice X, and I am tempted to read it as Y, reduces voltage without removing information. The difference is not politeness. It is experiment friendliness. Karl Popper would recognize the gain. A sentence that can be falsified is a sentence that can be learned from. A sentence that convicts in its very grammar cannot be tested without shaming the speaker. The shame prevents learning. The loop persists. Watch the body for signals that masquerade as insight. A pulse in the throat can feel like premonition. A cold palm can feel like evidence. Interoception is accurate about arousal, not about the world. The mind that uses body signals as world signals will prosecute coincidences with the solemnity of a judge hearing testimony. Marcus Aurelius pulled his attention back to governance each dawn with an almost boring reminder. You have power over your mind, not outside events. The outside event here is ambiguous data. The mind's power is to proportion belief, to delay verdict, to prefer repairable errors over irreversible harms.
Why lean so hard on old Romans and Scots? Because the habit is ancient, and the corrections are too. Bacon warned about overorder. Hume demanded proportion. Aurelius insisted on amendability. Nietzsche distrusted conviction that arrives early and stays late. None of these men issued laws. They built sentences sturdy enough to survive in rooms where emotion runs high. Pattern hunger thrives in those rooms. It needs companions that do not thrill, that do not flatter, that do not promise safety. It needs companions that keep experiments open until reality has had time to speak. A final turn, quiet and difficult. Pattern hunger often masks grief. The mind that overfits coincidence may be keeping busy to avoid the simple sentence, "I was hurt." Suspicion promises agency, where grief would ask for surrender. One cannot be wronged and unafraid at once. One must choose which truth to prioritize while healing. Grief slows the pattern machine because grief has no puzzles, only weather. Paranoia overdrive accelerates the machine because speed feels like survival. Slowness feels like exposure. Yet the mind that never slows never heals. It only replaces one set of fears with another and calls the rotation vigilance. When the machine is seen, the options change. Not because a command has been issued, but because recognition itself alters the field. A vigilant man can remain proud of his sensitivity to structure while refusing to worship it. He can keep his pattern sense as a craft and decline to make it a creed. He can prefer a life with some risks of being fooled to a life guaranteed to be alone. He can accept that the cost of trust is occasional injury and the cost of suspicion is certain isolation. He can hold Hume's proportion in one hand, Popper's falsification in the other, and Marcus's willingness to be corrected in his coat pocket, where his fingers will find it before the tongue does. Midnight will return, and with it the courtroom that never sleeps. The brain will whisper that a new constellation has been discovered in the static. The chest will perform its old ritual. The mouth will begin to form an old sentence. In such hours, some men have found it useful to remember that not every signal printed on the inside of the skull was sent from the outside world. Some have learned to wait until the jury of daylight arrives. Some have written in the margin of their own minds a small note. There is a difference between seeing and knowing, between guessing and proving, between being alert and being afraid. That note, reread often, becomes a counterweight, not a cure, a calibration. And then morning comes, plain and undesigned. The phone is quiet. The sky is literal. Work asks for attention that will not be rewarded by the little highs of suspicion. It will be rewarded by something slower. Bacon would call it the sovereignty of man, by which he meant mastery over oneself, extended through humble inquiry into the world. Russell might call it a tempered mind. Hume would be satisfied with proportion. Marcus would say simply, do what is in front of you with precise and genuine seriousness. The vigilant mind remains a gift when it is coupled with that seriousness. It sees real signals sooner, protects real danger better, loves real people more cleanly, because they are no longer being tried in absentia for crimes invented in the loudest hours of the night.